I mentioned earlier in the show, and I mentioned before we went to break, that today we would have with us an author that's written books like Ali, A Life, The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution, Get Capone, The Secret Plot That Captured America's Most Wanted Gangster, Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season, and Luckiest Man, the life and death of Lou Gehrig. But recently, Jonathan Eig has put out another great book about one of our great leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it's called King, A Life. So with us today, we have Pulitzer Prize-winning author and writer, Jonathan Eig, who has written his most latest wonderfulness called King, A Life. So, Jonathan, welcome to Choose Views. Welcome to the show this morning.
Thank you. It's nice to talk to you.
Had a little confusion on my end. I apologize. I thought you were calling us, and I said to Henry, "I think I left the number. I can't feel stupid here. What did I do with the number to reach out to Jonathan this morning?" So, thanks to our team here that was able to get that to us, so we could give you a holler. How you doing this morning, man?
Doing great, thanks.
So you've got an event coming up. Well, before we do that, let me back up, because looking at my notes, the one thing I wanted to do is kind of give you a little bit of a moment to let the listeners know who you are and what you've been, what you've been doing, how you were, all the great things about Jonathan that have gotten you to this point where you've got yet another phenomenal Pulitzer Prize winning book. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a longtime journalist. I started out in newspapers. I've been in Chicago since 1995, working for magazines and newspapers. And I started writing books about, more than 20 years ago now. My first book was a biography of Lou Gehrig. And I've been very lucky that I've been able to just keep writing books. I haven't had to go back to the daily grind. And but these books, are labors of love, but they take me 5 or 6 years to write each. So it's a big commitment. And but after working at newspapers for so long, the chance to spend 5 or 6 years, really becoming the world's leading expert on a subject is a joy. And then to do that for Martin Luther King, and to get to meet hundreds of people who knew Martin Luther King, and to shed new light on his life is really one of the greatest opportunities and thrills that I've ever had.
And now you're originally from Brooklyn, and you came to Chicago to go to Northwestern. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
What brought you from Brooklyn to? I mean, you probably frustrated some folks from home, because you went from New York to Chicago. You're going to the second city. Come on, Jonathan.
Well,
why are you leaving us?
Well, to be honest, my goal was always to get back to New York and work at the New York Times, but I liked Chicago and I decided to stay here. And it's been a great decision for me.
What is it about Chicago as an individual, but then as a professional, that you like?
Well, first of all, I met my wife here and raised a family, so that's a big plus. But I also, as a professional, I think Chicago is a place that, people push each other, but they also lift each other up. It's not cutthroat in the same way that New York might be. And I think it's easier for a writer to get support here, easier for a writer to stand out a little bit, and maybe to stay sane, because you don't see so many other writers, at every top as you might in Brooklyn right now.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, we love our Chicago. We love one of the things about Chicago, to your point, that I love is its welcomingness. I'm making up a word, but you came here from New York, and what you just said is very true from a lot of people who I know that are quote unquote transplants, and you've been here for a while, so you definitely have seen that. Tell us a little bit about your event that's coming up at the which is tomorrow, if I'm correct, at the Kenilworth Union Church.
Yeah, I couldn't be more excited about this. The folks from the church reached out to me 4 or 5 months ago, and asked if I would be willing to come up and do an event. And they've just put together a great event with a lot of different community groups. I think we're going to have a nice turnout. I think there's still room if people want to register. Just go to the church, kuc.org, and sign up there. But we're going to be talking about King, his legacy, his life, the fact that, we've kind of turned him into a national holiday and forgotten what he was like as a person, forgotten how, not just how courageous he was, but how radical he was and how religious he was. A lot of, people of I've missed the story on King all these years because we celebrate him by talking about I Have a Dream, and we don't get much past that. So I want people to remember that he was flesh and blood, and that he, had feelings, and that it makes his heroism, I think, all the more inspiring.
And I'm going to come right back to the event and then come back to what you just said. Guys, you can go to the Kenilworth Union Church, KUC.org, did you say?
Yes, that's right.
KUC.org to be able to attend the events tomorrow evening from 7 to 8 p.m. You guys should check it out. Now, coming back to what Jonathan just said about Dr. King. So, yes, you and I are, as I use the phrase often when I'm in the same age bracket as someone, you and I would have been in high school together or in high school at the same time. And we were alive. You were younger than I when Dr. King was assassinated. And we recognize how he changed not just lives of Americans, but lives of people throughout the world. And little old, Winnetka, Illinois, had Dr. King here in 1965. Tell us a little bit about that, which is, it's highlighted in your book, right?
Yeah, that's right. People forget that King was often traveling to the North, and he came ostensibly to raise money for the work he was doing in the South. But he also, when he came here, built a network and built a community and called out the northern segregation that he was seeing everywhere he went. He said, I may be here to raise money for our work in Birmingham or in Selma or in Montgomery, but I'm here to also remind you that your schools are segregated, your housing is segregated, your jobs are discriminatory, and I'm coming back. And we're going to talk about this because you have to deal with it. It's not just us. The South may be the most evident, but you may be disguising it better in the North, but you've got the same problem. And he did come back over and over again. He was in Chicago a lot. He lived here for much of 1966. Yeah. People forget he took up residence in North Lawndale. And, he left here dismayed with the level of racism that he saw in Chicago.
Well, here's one of the things that does it. The North versus South. Let's this from your experience in writing this book, but your experience just as living as a man in the United States of America. My father used to say this to me, Jonathan. He said, and my father grew up in rural Mississippi, as did my mother. They migrated north, as so many people did, not just folks of color, if you will, or black folks specifically. There was a lot of Southern racists that moved north for economic reasons, not just to get away from racism or, latent Jim Crow and all that. But they were folks who were probably middle of the road, white folks who moved from the South to the North, but they brought some of their cultural thinking, and geographical thinking to the North. And that's part of what Dr. King was talking about, is that those isms didn't leave just because people left. Is it a fair statement? Yeah,
fair statement, absolutely. And, sadly, we still see it today. Some of these things are baked into people, and like to think that time would make them go away, but it hasn't proven so. And, King, to his credit, called it out and said that the only way that it was going to get fixed was A, through government intervention, but B, primarily through learning to love our neighbors and acting and living up to what, he preached from the pulpit. And he believed that people could do better. And, he gave his life for that belief.
My father was one of the most fair people that I ever knew. I mean, I've had, like you, the opportunity to be around and raised and tutored by so many great men and women. My dad, if people were asking me, what would you say is your depiction of your father? I would say he was the most fair man, most fair person that I ever knew. And that would be my dad's label. He was fair, and he always played fair. But he always said fair doesn't always mean what people think it is. It's also about doing the thing that's hard, because then that creates, how did he used to say this, Jonathan? He said, basically, that creates a level playing field. And Dr. King was all about that. He was about it being fair. And when he spoke about the amount of money that had not been given to the African-American community post-enslavement and Jim Crow, but the amount of money that had gone to other communities, he based that in, that's not fair. If you can't,
that's right.
And so talk a little bit about that, if you can.
Yeah, one of real pet peeve is that we all talk about the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington, August 28th, 1963, and every time that holiday comes around, we talk about I have a dream, and everybody says, quotes the lines that I dream of the day that one day we'll be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. But we forget the first half of that speech where he talked about economic inequality and reparations and police brutality. And he said America had written a check to black Americans and it had come up with insufficient funds. So it was time to pay. He said, after the Voting Rights Act passed and after the Civil Rights Act passed, he began to say, those things didn't cost you a dime. It didn't cost you a dime to give us the right to vote. It didn't cost you a dime to integrate lunch counters. You're going to have to pay at some point because the economic reality is that the hands have not been dealt squarely, and you're going to have to pay to make that right. It's a matter of justice. It's not a matter of greed. It's a matter of justice.
My father would have loved to have read your book because of the way in which you formatted the subjects, and one of the things that he talked about, my father often talked about, and we go back to the murder of Fred Hampton and how our government played a part in that. And we know, many people may not, but we understand the involvement of COINTELPRO and all the rest. Well, you actually you kind of cracked the code a little bit in some of the FBI's declassified information being a part of your book. Sure, talk about that if you can.
That's one of the biggest things that surprised me about this book. I was surprised by a lot of things, including, the fact that King suffered as much as he did emotionally. But the biggest surprise was the FBI, the extent of the FBI's surveillance, how far the responsibility went up the food chain. This was not just J. Edgar Hoover. This went all the way to the White House. JFK and LBJ were not just aware, but encouraging this surveillance, encouraging the FBI to use this information, encouraging them to distribute the information about King's love affairs to the media, and really trying to destroy him. In fact, at one point, the FBI sent a bunch of tapes from King's hotel rooms to his home, hoping that his wife would hear it, that he would resign, or perhaps even commit suicide. The letter contained with that told King the only way out for him was suicide, and that's our government, our tax dollars doing that to try to destroy King, to try to break up the civil rights movement. And I knew about some of this, but I was shocked at just how far it went.
Yeah, I mean, it's I keep referencing back to my father, and I don't mean to make it about my dad, but he was a sit-down-at-the-knee kind of dude that would say, listen, this is what you need to know about this. This is what they're not telling you. And so oftentimes Pop would say to me, it's as much as what people are telling you, it's about what people ain't telling you. And in this case with Dr. King, he was like, listen, because my dad was part of the movement. He was out there along with my uncle, who was a former senator, a state senator here in Illinois. They were part of the movement, elbows deep, as so many black men were at that time. And they would sit you down and say, this is what's really going on. To that end, when you, in your research, you just said this is one of the things that you found kind of like, wow, hair on the back of your neck, surprising. What have been a couple of the other things that you've, I won't say learned, because that sounds arrogant for me to put it that way, but what were some of the other discoveries that you're like, I can't believe I just read that?
Well, I discovered a lot of archival material that people didn't know about, hadn't been used in previous books. I discovered Martin Luther King's father wrote an autobiography that was never published. Only 2 copies exist in the world, and I found them, and it's fascinating to see that this is a guy who's comes out of sharecropping, who at the age of 12, this is his father, moves off the farm and raises his family, and most people don't even know that his name was Mike King, and he changed his name to Martin Luther, and then said to his son, "Hey, Junior, guess what? You're getting a new name too." Tell people, I'm sorry, Jonathan, tell people how that, behind the curtain, how that actually went down, what really did take place. I know the story, but you tell the story. Yeah, so Mike King Sr. comes off the farm and moves to Atlanta and starts, getting ambitious and woos this woman and decides and becomes the preacher at Ebenezer and changes his name to ML. And he didn't even have a middle name. He just picked the L. And then he traveled to Germany in the years right before Hitler's rise to power, and learned about Martin Luther, the reformer, and decided that that name would sound even better than ML, and that it would be an inspiration, because he too was committed to reform, and that's how, Little Mike, as they called him, got his name changed. And at first he kind of resisted it. He continued to introduce himself as Mike and ML, but by the time he got to the seminary, he thought, hey, it does sound pretty cool to be Martin Luther. So it happened gradually, and it just goes to show like his increasing ambition too.
Yeah. You said that you didn't use the word depression, but that he emotionally was, many times emotionally, he was distraught and suffered emotionally. What are some of the things you learned there?
Yeah, it's very interesting. From an early age, he twice attempted suicide as a teenager. And throughout his life, he was hospitalized for what they called exhaustion, but what his friends recognized as signs of depression. And it grew worse as the FBI began to clamp down on him, and he began to feel like the world was closing in on him, and his phones were being tapped. And he felt like after a while that America really didn't want him around anymore. And it was, it's ironic that we can read the transcripts of his phone calls, and we know exactly what he was saying in private. And what he was saying was that he felt like no one was listening to him anymore, and no one cared, and he was losing hope. But he refused to give up, and that's what really moved me more than anything. I think I would have quit about 100 times, and he never quit. In fact, he kept doubling down on his beliefs that, if you're really going to preach nonviolence, that means you got to call out the war in Vietnam too. If you're really going to preach materialism, that means you're going to lose some donors, and you have to go north, and you have to talk about the landlords in Chicago. And he lost political capital for doing those things, and he just kept doing them over and over because he believed it was the right thing to do.
And it was the right thing to do for all people. I mean, this is the thing that oftentimes folks, I believe, miss when it comes to civil rights and playing fair and having a level playing field. It is the classic use of the line, a rising tide lifts all ships. This is Dr. King's belief it's about what's happened to folks who were enslaved and are descendants of enslavement. But it's also about making sure that rural white guy and his family get a fair shake too. And a lot of people miss that when they talk about Dr. King.
Yeah, absolutely true. He said, we're all children of God, and that means the Vietnamese are no different from us. But, his last crusade, we forget, was called the Poor People's Campaign, and it was about a shift from civil rights to human rights, and he was going to fight for guaranteed income and guaranteed jobs and guaranteed health care and guaranteed early child care. And that made him more unpopular than ever. Yep. The government was terrified that, whoa, now you're coming after capitalism? That's even scarier than coming after racial equality for many people in Washington, D.C.
Well, because it included, and this has been my assessment. Again, I go back to at the knee of my father and so many other black men at the time who said this is what's really going on. The thing that my father made clear to me, said there's a reason that Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King and Malcolm were killed. That is not just the reasons about race. Because Bobby Kennedy's plight was not just necessarily about race. It was when the Poor People's Campaign merged with what Dr. King had been talking about and merged with what Malcolm had been talking about. The biggest threat was, in my opinion, based on my observation, was that these three guys were behind the scenes talking and were starting to come together, or at least realize that the real message was the people that they were working for, fighting for, coming together was a bigger threat than any of the individual campaigns. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that, to me, the bottom line is pretty simple, and it's pretty hard to argue against. Whether you believe in conspiracy theories or not, these people represented a threat to the status quo, and certain people saw it as their job to preserve the status quo. And there's no question that J. Edgar Hoover saw Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as a threat to the status quo, that if they succeeded in their work, power would have to be shared, and people who had been denied power for a long time were going to get some. And they saw their job as to make sure that the people who had power kept it, period. And whether they, were involved in any plans, to assassinate, they didn't have to be, because they created an environment that made people think that they were doing their patriotic duty by taking out somebody who posed a threat to the American way.
which doesn't sound too dissimilar to where we are now. That can is continually getting kicked down the road of the check that bounced, that didn't go through in terms of many of our social interactions, not just racism or culturalism, but in any of the other factions, whether it be our LGBTQ community, whether it be women's rights, reproductive rights, and the list goes on, that those cans keep getting either kicked down the road legislatively, or there are people who recognize, to your wonderful point, Jonathan, that if they think that if other folks have access to those things, that it's going to take away from them. And so the zero-sum game conversation comes in, and I applaud you for the book. We've had a couple people this morning that have sent me text messages already that say that they learned, they read the book, they didn't realize how illuminating it was, and similarities of then to now. Learned much more about Dr. King than I ever thought, that I thought that I knew. One person said I need to read it again now because I missed some things. So kudos to you, man. I mean, this is awesome. Final couple of questions. Why did you decide to write this particular book at this particular time?
Well, I was working on my Muhammad Ali book, and first of all, I just realized, wow, I'm interviewing people who knew Ali and King. And I just began wondering, what was it like to hang out with Martin Luther King? And as I began interviewing them, I realized that our view of King had really been skewed, that the creation of the national holiday in some ways had done him a disservice, and it had defanged him and given us this safe version of King. And that we'd also lost sight of his humanity. We'd forgotten that he had feelings, and that he had failures, and that he had fears. So all of that made me think it might be time for a new book. And I'm happy to say that I was right about that people were really desperate for, I think the response by readers shows that people were really hungry to read about him as a person and to be inspired by him, because we don't have too many moral leaders these days that we can feel like, are really holding to a set of values that, and King fits that category for sure.
Well, I'm holding the book up on camera right now, which you probably can't see, but the book is called King, A Life by Jonathan Ike, best-selling author of Ali, and a guy who's just been putting out this type of work, these tomes that give folks the opportunity to really understand what's behind the scenes with some of our quote-unquote American, I won't just say heroes, but American figures. Jonathan, how can folks find you if they can't make the event tomorrow at the Kenilworth Union Church? How can they find you?
I'll go to my website, jonathanike.com, and you can find out there more about the book. You can contact me through the website, and but I hope some folks will come out tomorrow night and see us. We should have a great event.
Sounds good. We'll have you back again because I want to talk to you about some of your other great writings and make sure we try to help sell some books as well. Jonathan Ike, guys, thank you for being with us this morning. We really appreciate you taking the time. Be safe. Have a great event tomorrow, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Be well, man. There you go, guys. Jonathan Ike, the author of King, A Life, among others. And I'll read these to you again before we hit the break. Some of the other things that you want to check out that he's written, and I'll try to get to that page real quickly because my fingers aren't working. Come on, Chew. There we go. Ali, A Life. The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution. Get Capone, The Secret Plot That Captured America's Most Wanted Gangster. Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season, and Luckiest Man, the life and death of Lou Gehrig. Jonathan Ike, author, best-selling author, and Pulitzer Prize-winning author, right here in Chicagoland area, y'all.